Hello, I'm Alex Totaro.
And I'm Alex Goldstein.
We're a couple of TV nerds with opinions, and this is the thing that gets you to the thing, a Halt and Catch Fire fan podcast.
This week we're on season 1, episode 5, called Adventure, which means we're examining our dad issues and learning to do business with Japan.
If you've listened before, you'll know we're going episode by episode, rewatching the show on Amazon Prime in the UK. Right now, it's also available on Netflix in the US and Foxtel in Australia. So wherever you are, we hope you can find it. It's more than worth the effort.
Okay then, let's work out what's going on our third shelf.
So right off the bat,
Yeah, right off the bat, what did you think of this one? Because we had mixed feelings about 3 and 4, right? We were other opposite. Like I forgave 3, you forgave 4. How did we feel about 5?
it's like a team boss, team Joe situation here, and I keep switching the jerseys. I I quite enjoyed it. It was you call this filler, I think, when you messaged me, didn't you?
A little bit. A little bit.
But I thought it was good filler.
Yes, it's quality filler.
I liked
It's
it.
there were some things that felt like back on track and familiar, but I wasn't sure that we seem to learn a lot without going anywhere. If you see what I mean. It's like we've introduced all this stuff, but I don't know if it's taken us forward in our understanding of Joe or Cameron or Boz. Like we could have guessed a lot of the stuff that we got confirmed. I think maybe we got a little bit more about Gordon that was quite interesting.
And Joe, to an extent, even if it was more cliche, do you not think with his father?
I think we could have guessed overbearing father
Fair.
from everything we found out so far. Like they laid that trail so beautifully in the previous episodes that we almost didn't need them to fill in those details. I'm not sorry that they did. Like it wasn't an uninteresting episode by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know if I loved it.
It was kind of running around in circles in a way. But I guess what I appreciate about it is the fact that we can start running around in circles in a way that doesn't feel like we're diverting, to your point about getting back on track, and the fact that some of the guest stars start to return in a more cohesive way, maybe without going all out like we've seen in episode 3. So
Yeah, and we do get a new one. We get Donna's dad, and we get to know a little bit more about him, and he's quite interesting. So yeah, we will come to him in a bit, but we get the 2 dads in the picture now. But yeah, you're right. It's definitely not the absolute overload of episode 3 where like it was like, let's meet everyone that these people have ever known in their whole lives.
I know. And your point about it being filler, I want to go back to that for just a second, because it does really make me question what role that kind of content has in a 10 episode arc in a way. We talked previously on your 22 episode shows that do require some step backs in terms of this whole episode is going to be a flashback on with a spotlight on X or Y.
Or you'll get like a bottle episode out of nowhere just to fill. Like it's a nice, in a 22 episode arc, it's actually, rather than filler, it's like a palate cleanser. It's like you've stuck with us
Sure.
for such a long process that we're going to give you little insights and we're going to go down little cul-de-sacs or uncover a little gem or have a self-contained episode. And I don't know, in a 10 episode arc, I don't know if you have that much room for that. But at the same time, there's only so long that you can have, like for this specific 10 episode arc, there's only so long that you can have technical problems and technical hitches being the story lever, right?
Yeah.
So at some point you need to have an emotional lever for an episode. And I think that this was a solid attempt at that. I don't know if I'd have noticed how fillery it can be if I wasn't examining it episode by episode for this. Like obviously when I watched it the first time, I was taken enough to just keep going on to the next episode. I was like, yeah, I've got it. So I might be judging it a little bit unfairly because I've got like a magnifying glass on it, like at that micro level. Like I don't know if I would have noticed that if I hadn't been doing it this way.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel slow by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I'm rewatching the Americans as well, which I love, but it is a slog to get through. It is very slow. It's very difficult to understand. So, in this case, well, there are weird inconsistencies around what the writers want us to focus on, such as the sort of outcome of this article getting out, right? And that being, it sort of shrunk to it being a thing that happened that I guess drove something forward, but it wasn't like a major, look where we are, we've gotten to the next stage of development. So talking about that, who are the writers behind this episode as we start to continue to shift, right? Talent behind the camera.
So we've got a new director, but actually we're going back in time with the writers because we're going back to the co-creators, going back to the co-showrunners. So Christopher C. Rogers and Christopher Cantwell wrote this one. There is an additional writing credit for Darby Waller, who came from Mad Men and various other things. And there's also a story credit for Jamie Pacino, who has a long and healthy list of like TV movie writing and producing credits to her name as well. So clearly the sense I got of, I feel a bit back on track may have come from the fact that it's back in the hands of its co-creators who kind of have a feeling about where they want that to go. That said, it is a new director in the hot seat. It's Ed Bianchi, who he came from things like Deadwood, Damages, Law and Order, and also had a single credit for Mad Men also,
right,
before coming to *Halt and Catch Fire*. And he's then gone on to like The Killing, Boardwalk Empire, Bates Motel. So we've gone from really cinematic film directors. We've had one director whose background is a bit more musical, and now we've got a really, really through and through TV guy, right? A guy who lives and breathes TV. So really interesting to see if that had an effect on the way that it's filmed, because now we're also 5 episodes in, so he will have been influenced to some extent by what came before. What did you think?
I kind of like that we have a TV guide. I kind of like that we have someone that can continue to elevate, because what you get a lot with the cinematic, with the more or film sort of originated directors is they want to treat the whole thing like a film. They want to treat the whole thing like a standalone piece, and it absolutely can be. We haven't necessarily seen episodes resolve in a close-ended way, like you would a procedural or maybe a law drama, which I like, because those kind of shows just start a new episode as if nothing ever happened, right? It's kind of
this is not Monster of the Week or Police Procedural or any of that. Yeah, you can't have anything neatly tied in a bow.
No, absolutely.
And maybe you're right. That
I have noticed a lot of differences in the camera work. Again, diving once again into some of how the camera work continues to shift focus to our main characters. Now, mind you, we're in an episode where once again we have tons of new characters suddenly. Phil Carter Electric, right? We kind of have this, I would say, 3 teams going on, if you want to count Joe as part of that. But you've got the sort of Cameron software camp. You've got your Gordon Dungeons and Dragons masters. That's the only way I can describe those guys with those mustaches.
No, that is perfect. They are. It's funny because I will go into the character development in a bit, but they kind of try to paint the coders in quite stereotypical brushstrokes to some extent. Yeah. But it's actually Gordon's nerds are just they're this wonderful like team of trolls. I absolutely love it.
Even the way they're sitting, right? The way they're sitting around the table on the board as if someone was waiting to move the next piece. And then you've got Joe, and you've got Joe in that environment of senior management, but also up and down. And we'll touch on the third shelf because I love that. Actually, I felt like what a great scene with Boss and those retailers. But before we dive into that, it felt like the camera was once again very economic from the point of view of accomplishing a lot with very few movements and very few cuts. Now, I had to sort of go back I actually watched this episode like 2 times plus the original time, just because something wasn't sticking. But it stuck in the end. And the camera work sort of, I had to find some times where I thought it was single takes, for example, which I thought was going to be quite an interesting take. And it wasn't, but it was all done in a very seamless way. And once again, the things that I've noticed, and you might have different notes than me, but the thing that I've noticed is how the camera starts to position the hierarchy of the characters. Now, we've seen this a lot maybe in the pilot where Joe was always kind of on top of Gordon in his cubicle, right? So the camera sort of matched that
Mm.
power, maybe not as black and white as some of the other episodes. But this episode, one of the things that I wrote is Joe is just towering over others. Like the camera is just very low. It moves with Joe, right? So it kind of stays that way. And there are really interesting bits that I've noticed where, for instance, when you have Cameron come in to confront Joe on whatever that is, and you can't see me, but I'm doing air quotes. Um, the camera sort of is fixed in a position where it's placed below or it's placed lower, pointing upwards. And Joe comes in and he's obviously towering over the scene. Cameron comes in, and the only time they're kind of at equal sort of footing is when the camera shifts to allow them to be further away, to be put on the same frame, if that makes sense. It's very hard to explain without actually showing it.
No, I know what you mean. And like, we know that, so Lee Pace is a really big guy. He's like 6'5".
Another here's
Um,
our Lee Pace appreciation minute. Just let's throw that
yeah,
one in.
Lee Pace appreciation moment has to happen. But he's gigantic. Like he's a really, really big guy. And I feel like up until now, it's been a case of working around that rather than going with it. And now the camera is like, you're huge. let's just take a moment to appreciate that you literally tower over all of these other people,
Yeah,
and emphasize it, and emphasize his kind of like
stature.
his need to his need to dominate the conversation, his need to run everything, his need to set the vision, his need to like really be like and you realize this is in relation to his sort of domineering dad later, but it's really great that the camera just goes, we're going to use your physical stature to really underpin that. The other thing I noticed with the camera work, and I don't know if you spotted this too, is that there are a lot of shots where the camera sits just behind someone's shoulder. And
Yeah.
so what you get is a kind of the focus is on the person sort of in the distance, and then you've got this slightly foregrounded shoulder or whatever. So it feels like you're listening in. It
Yes.
almost has an almost documentary feel to like you are just sitting just outside this room having a little eavesdrop on these conversations, and I really liked that. I thought that was a really beautiful window into what we were seeing.
I'm so glad you brought that up. So I've actually written down a whole scene that I thought actually exemplifies and illustrates that, and that textured layering in a way. One of the scenes where Joe gets the sort of memo that his father called, and Debbie, the secretary, is sort of filling him in on one, what's going on with that rally thing they're all going to in the end, and that his father called and all that stuff. And the camera is in Joe's office. She's outside, and it's going through the door frame, which means that your vision is limited to probably 40% of what that entire room is. And what I loved about this is that the entire scene, which involves her facing Joe, so you can't really look at her, Joe coming in, picking that up, having a reaction to this, then coming in, having looking at the number, almost calling it, not doing it, and that's all with a single take, and that's all without changing sort of the camera angle. To your point around it being more sort of documentary like, and actually one of the things that you start picking up is some of the sounds start really coming together, especially on the next episode, which we'll talk to when we talk about episode 6. But I do really love that because we talked about this and when we were discussing this in our previous episode around how they can sort of repurpose the space in many different ways through doing these kind of techniques.
Absolutely. And it almost, at times, it felt like looking at a painting. It had like a touch of Vermeer, a touch of these kind of Dutch paintings where everything is through windows and doors and it's at one slight remove. And these are all people who are still struggling with their remove from each other as well. And it felt like the camera was
Yeah.
replicating these complicated relationships, because every time we think Joe and Gordon have found a way to communicate, they undo it
Yeah.
again. And
Yeah.
it's just positioning, for example, in that scene where Joe tries to mock Gordon and Gordon finally grows a pair. And he has to reveal something about himself that's a little bit humiliating to do it, but he just sort of stands up and announces
Yeah.
it to the room. And that camera's so low at first, showing like even though Joe's slouching against the wall, he still looks gigantic compared to all these other people. And then the camera just sort of slightly, as it almost comes down to Gordon's level a little bit to just slightly
Yes.
elevate him as he finds his moment. And there is a beautiful touch. Like we don't appreciate Scoot McNairy enough on this show at all. So a moment for him. His hands are shaking when he does that. I mean, it's just
Yes.
he's just so good.
I've noticed that in other scenes, and I find it so amazing that he can get into character like this. And to your point around that shift in stature or level of camera, one of the things that I really noticed in this episode was that the camera work actually revolves around reactions. The scene that I was describing earlier actually ends with a close up of Joe's face, which is amazing when you think about the fact that we started that same scene with Joe far away talking to someone else, and it ends in a close up, and the camera didn't do anything. And this is something that I've when you go back to, and I know we're skipping around from a plot point of view a little bit here, but when you go to the Japanese man and the camera's interactions with Joe's father, also called Joe MacMillan, huh? Handy. My father also has my same name, so I chuckle there.
Oh, that's for years. I had my grandfather's name. So until I got married and changed my surname, I actually just had. Well, obviously I have the female version, but yes, I was Alexander Rumbus's granddaughter. So yeah, definitely both come from traditions where there's like a little patriarchal implanting there of like you come from this line. But obviously for Joe, it's such a like this is a very unsubtle episode on many levels. Not least of all because it
Yeah.
literally takes a sledgehammer to things by the end. Uh, but that sense that Joe is so trying so desperately to be his own man and he can't even have his own name is yeah, it's a lovely little like underline and underscore for the whole thing. Um, but you're right. I mean, the camera. It's not just the camera I noticed, but also the color of the whole episode. It all works around reactions and status and where people are in relation to each other. So one of the things I noticed is so obviously they do the morning routine at the beginning, and this time,
Yeah, and we're seeing this
yeah,
again, right? Sorry to cut off, but we're sort of, and it's quite an interesting one because it's been right after the other episode, and we're sort of diving into this kind of thing again. Like, is this something that we're going to see going forward, or
it does feel like a repeat motif. And what's really interesting about it is we see Cameron and Joe reversed, right? She does what Joe usually does.
yes,
She gets up, she stretches. It's like the little butt to camera shot there that everyone gets. So if you're a fan of, I mean, to be fair, you should be a fan of Mackenzie Davis because she's marvelous. But you know, it's kind of she gets that kind of triumphant moment of yes, here I am, face the world, and it's sort of saturated with this yellow morning light. And then you go to Joe's flat, and Joe's apartment is always blue. Like blue is incredibly strongly associated with Joe. His shirts tend to be blue. His suits tend to be blue. The light in his apartment is very blue, and this time he's broken. He's physically broken because he's taken a beating, and he's having a moment where he needs to recalibrate. Now we see that he goes on to have that third shelf speech, which feels like Joe is back, but he's got to have this moment of recovery and this moment of kind of like putting himself back together again. Now later in that episode, Cameron comes to his apartment and his dad is in it. And at that point, for the first time that I can remember, and I'm happy to be called out by anybody else who's been watching us closely, but for the first time that I can remember, the light in Joe's flat is yellow. It has that yellow, homely shade, the one they use for the Clark's house, the one they use for certain rooms in Cardiff, maybe Boz's office. And that has not
yeah,
happened at all. And it never happens, or it hasn't happened up until now, when Joe has been in the apartment. And I loved that. I loved it.
that's a really good observation because we talked like last episode about light following Cameron in that sense, like her style of lighting. So is it because she was also in the room, or is that neutral ground? Is that Cardiff Electric look neutral ground because you got Joe's father in you know in the enemy camp in a really weird way if you want to make it more convoluted. But that's a great observation actually, and we continue to have a show that sort of almost excels being shot at night, and that's something I haven't noticed since, again, complete opposite of this the spectrum, since Game of Thrones, right? It's kind of that how removing these elements allows you to be more expressive, which is kind of interesting when you think about the fact that obviously the better lit it is, the more you can react. But we're talking about characters that hide in the shadows. And very quickly, I want to touch on something that you said, only because you just mentioned it, that Joe is fractured both, I think, physically and emotionally in this episode. But because we do have some elements of Cameron stepping in to call him out on stuff. She's sort of pushing back on certain things, and he's being cool about it, or he thinks he's being cool about it. But it is kind of interesting to see that uh, it's sort of that crack through the armor that at the same time that the father comes into town after such a win from the previous episode. Like it like you said, it's kind of beating you over the head with it. And I'm so sorry that we said the show wasn't going to do this, and I think it doesn't do this, or it gets better at it.
No, I don't think it's a common problem for this show at
No.
all. I just think this episode just it indulged itself a little bit, and it gets away with it. And ultimately I didn't not enjoy the episode.
Sure.
Sorry for the terrible double negative, but I did enjoy the episode ultimately. But it's just it almost felt like episodes 3 and 4 had got a little bit woolly, and 5 was like a quick F5, just a little quick refresh, just to remind you where we come from, what we're doing. Let's get us all back on track. Let's get everybody's motivations and sort of background a bit clearer, with a bit more clarity. And it's quite funny because then it ends on this barbecue scene,
The rally thing, yeah,
which is unusually an outdoor, very busy scene, which I don't think we've really seen much of in the show up until now. All the other outdoor scenes have either been like a street or Nathan's ranch or like the country house that Lulu lives in. And here you've got a really, really busy thing, and you've got Boz in really bright colors for the first time that I can remember, and Cameron in very striking colors, and Joe is still in his corporate blue. Like, it's funny, everything around him looks super saturated, and it's almost like he desaturates the light when he moves through things.
He sucks it in.
He just sucks it, like it's almost like he's just like sucks in the energy around him and bottles it. And then he has this dramatic ending, but still he's still in a suit. No one else is, but he still is. And I love those little touches.
Before we move on to some of the other elements of the actual narrative, one more thing I want to talk about camera work. And it's not so much camera work only as in conjunction with the directing and the acting, but there's such a key emphasis on distance, both apart and together. And we're going to dive into this because I got a fun fact from our friends at imdb.com, who do not sponsor this podcast. Ooh. But
could if they wanted to.
But could, guys, we'll drop your emails. You know where to find us. Cheeky plug. But the whole your point around how things are, certain things are layered, but then you look at the scene, the golf course scene between Gordon and the father-in-law, and the camera is bang on in the middle, and they are on opposite sides, like almost getting to the safe zone here, right? Depending on what you're watching, you might even cut them off. And then you have the whole interaction with the Japanese man where Gordon keeps touching them, which is offensive to their culture. And according to MTV, we'll talk about that. And they do really play around with that on top of the camera work. And so your point around Joe coming into this really crowded space and sort of blending in with that, to me is really interesting because he sort of runs through that and goes straight into paying the guy off and completely beating that car up, doesn't he?
He wears that suit like armor, and he just like, even in the morning routines, quite often and I don't think it did it in this episode, but quite often you'll see Joe's morning routine as him choosing from a rack of like identical shirts, and
Steve.
the
Steve and
yeah,
Mark.
he's Steve, but instead of doing Steve's trademark, I'm dressing down, just in case you hadn't noticed, here is my uniform of dressing down. And there's even been like, there is genuinely a research paper out there called the red sneakers effect, which is about like non-conformity in like tech leadership. And there's like almost like a push for people like Mark Zuckerberg to look super, super relaxed, right? He's still doing the classic 80s kind of yuppie thing.
Yeah.
But you can tell he knows it's armor as well. Like even when in the previous episodes where he talks to Cameron about like or rather talks to the secretary about telling Cameron to wear a bra or whatever, it's like, yeah, non-conform as much as you like, but ultimately it's all like what he knows how to do better than anything is sell. He sells to everyone all the time. And one of the things he sells them is his own persona.
Right.
And there's so much of that. And then at the end, when he's like, he takes off the jacket and he goes in there with a sledgehammer. It's like, is this a moment for Joe? Like, is he finally gonna grow up a little bit and let down some of those defenses and be a bit more human? Like, it's a big, like, that was almost to me the most thrilling thing about the episode is like, maybe we have made a tiny little breakthrough on Joe, but we've left it to the last 10 seconds of the episode to hint at it. And I don't know. I like
he knows the value of that persona and how you portray and project yourself, right? It's how he's gotten around. And we've already gotten references around the same suit, different tie, IBM corporate dude. And Mr. Joe MacMillan, father, senior, is also in his suit and looks, top notch, clean, not a fairy dust in his shoulder. And again, we sort of expect that, to your point, they father like son type situation. Joe's sort of challenge here is blending in, and that's what we talked about from episode 1, and how he's an out-of-towner who is kind of proud to be from the metropolis that is IBM in the grand scheme of what they've done for the industry, but also finding himself. And you also see this in references with Debbie, like, oh, are you coming to the ball? Please, I'm from New York. Like you hicks. This is nothing compared to what we do. And then he ends up going. So he does find those ways. But back to my point earlier, he also finds those ways through Cameron and how she puts her foot down. And she really surprised me with Joe's father.
Genuinely, because I'd forgotten what happens in that scene.
Yeah.
For a minute, I was taken in by her as well. Like, I mean, again, fair play to Mackenzie Davis for being marvelous always. But for a minute, I was like, she can't be that. Like, Cameron can't be that naive, can she? And I was almost beginning to scribble down notes like, really? Isn't it out of character for her to be this naive? And then she like clearly shows that she knows the entire thing is BS.
Of course.
And I was so relieved. I was so relieved that they hadn't gone off piste with what is it developing into a brilliant character. And she, that whole scene was the way that she just knows how to manage both Joes. Like she's just learnt all their levers and seen them for who they are. And it's clearly what attracts Joe to her is the fact that he can manipulate anyone else. He can dazzle Gordon or yell at him. Like he's got Gordon's two levers, which are approval and disapproval. Like he pulls Gordon's puppet strings like anything. He hasn't really worked out Donna yet, but he hasn't needed to.
No.
But with Cameron, he can try and try and try, but ultimately, if she wants to throw a tantrum or if she wants to just throw it back at him and go, right, this is how we're going to play this. Okay, I'll play it your way then. If you say something with enough confidence, you get what you want.
Yeah.
And she just plays his game.
And she learns.
It's absolutely brilliant. And I love that dynamic. I love how it's like, you're right that this episode reveals more of that. And that's really fun. And to your point about Joe learning to assimilate, like learning to be part of the team, I found fascinating that sequence at the beginning with the baseball bat. Now,
yeah,
throughout they've tried to tie that baseball bat very tightly to Joe Sr. And obviously, I mean, we're not American, but it's obviously quite tightly symbolic of the kinds of things you would play with your dad, right?
Yeah, you're playing catch, you're
Sort of,
playing baseball. They train you in something. They expect you to excel at it. Yeah.
it's the typical, it's the classic American pastime, right? And all that kind of
Especially in the
thing.
'80s, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. If it hadn't been a bat, it would have been a catcher's mitt. So,
Hmm.
and then he uses that. He uses this prop that sort of signifies a perfect childhood when actually we know he has had anything but, and literally bends his way, like he swings through the pain until he can get his range of motion back. And it's like he starts out, you get that tiny window in him having been battered and broken and feeling like at his lowest ebb. And then by doing something that is like a performance, it's like a performance of childhood, a performance of growing up, he puts himself in the zone. And the very next time we see him, he's giving that amazing speech in the boardroom, and he just feels like Joe again. And getting that little insight into his process. And I have to say that scene could have been quite corny. It could have been quite hokey, except that once again, Lee Pace, moment of genius. He's just very, very good, isn't he? Like annoyingly good.
I know he's really good and he's poker face as well, right? Like he does not flinch, and he's so bought into the character, and he does these Joe things, right? Like this is now like a Joe thing that he would do.
Yeah, he just feels incredibly authentic.
Let's talk about that boardroom scene because I love that dynamic between Boss and Joe, because we were talking about this last episode a little bit around who needs to be in the room for certain things. And to me, when everyone was asking for certain specs and Boss is not able to give the answer, and Joe's just there like, oh, I'm just some dude from. It's fascinating because it's almost like Joe did it like he was planning to do it, but actually it played out that way. It kind of plays into his hands, and he keeps it close to his chest. Like I guarantee you that, and we've seen the kind of madness to that process. He's not really told anyone that he wants to do something that goes on the third shelf, and that the next year you'll improve it, and that where IBM go, like we're getting the lay of the land here from that
Mm-hmm.
that technological point of view, and it's just so
Yes.
great to see how Boss is kind of put in his place, and how their apparent rivalry is kind of coming to a head around what they both bring to the table.
I almost feel like Boz is now beginning to get more comfortable with where he fits in this.
Yeah.
Like he has started to understand that his job is to provide that stability. And I can't remember who says it to who, but there is a quote somewhere in this episode where somebody goes, "Oh, you know John Bosworth, Cardiff's a solid company." Uh, and that's what he represents. He represents the history, the heritage, the solidity, and he's beginning to occupy that. He's beginning to go, okay, if I do relationships and authenticity, then that's what I do. And he does sit back in the scene and let Joe talk. Like in previous times when Joe has done his big speech, Boz has tried to puncture it a lot more. And now he's sort of part of the game now. He's part of the crew now. He's understanding a bit more what he can do, and he's feeling more valued. And like I'm beginning to really like Boz. Like I'm beginning to buy into Team Boz.
I know. Well, so am I, more so than Joe for sure. But another thing that stood out to me around this interaction in that particular case is how how even in Texas, those the industry is changing from the point of view of the whole joke about the secretary and taking them out when you're screwing around behind your wife's back. That doesn't fly anymore because the industry is growing up, and that to me was the major rift between Joe, who's younger, and Boss, and the sort of the old macho mentality that we always reference in relation to what Texas is and represents and how business is done there. So I did really like that coming to a point where it's actually giving us insight into the industry, not just what's going on in that particular, um, not just what's going on in that particular room. Now, for taking out some of the like purely basing the next point on narrative, are they the only ones truly doing this? Because we're not really seeing pressure from the outside. We no longer have IBM on our back. The financial issues, I guess we're in bed with Lulu, and we got the funding, and which is like,
Yeah, something somewhere has been sorted out on that, and the money
yeah,
pressures and the lawsuit pressures seem to have kind of melted away,
they're
and now it's
separated.
more
Yeah,
a well, now it's more a case of identity. Like, what is this product? What is it
yeah.
supposed to do? What does it do for Cardiff? What does it say about Cardiff and Cardiff's trajectory? And more importantly, like, what is it doing for Gordon and Joe and Cameron? Like, what legacy is it creating for them?
Well, I love that naming scene when they're in that sort of war room and trying to figure it out. And of course, it's all the men and the geeks, right? Like
Yeah,
saying they wanted to call it random things. And then Cameron comes in and it's like, well, I get to name it. I created the bios for it. That was an interesting
absolutely.
one.
And that wonderfully that when they get all really clunky about like Linda Lovelace instead of Ada, who is who she actually means.
Yeah,
It dates it as well beautifully because we're talking about people who will, who are in the early 80s. So
yeah,
like even that, and I think there's a Wrath of Khan joke in that scene as well. So it just
yeah.
for once there's this wonderful little like it sets the date in quite
Crossroads.
a it sets the date in quite a natural way. It seems to be along with the kind of hidden exposition in that third shelf speech. It does feel like this episode is very conscious of when it's set. Um, and I quite but it does it gently, it does it naturally, and I quite like that. It felt period in a warm kind of familiar way, which I really liked.
Yeah, we also have Joe's dad saying, I'm gonna get on the plane to Bill Gates and he's just gonna talk, you know, run circles around
Yeah,
me. And we once again have Cameron in that sort of teacher type dynamic where she is teaching someone else about her craft. And we go back to thinking of these roles as craft, as proper art. And I love that, right? I love that Cameron sort of stands up for her work, and it's so funny how it's combined or juxtaposed with this new guy coming in and sort of taking over the department, and that Joe had to get her out. That first bit was kind of weird of her just being somewhere else for a second.
yeah, I didn't really understand where she'd gone or why she'd gone there, but it was like, oh, she's taken a break. Oh, yeah, all right. Yeah, that was just a little bit awkward. But once I got on board with that, I was like, he got her out of the way to install someone who fits his vision of what a professional manager looks like. And then she duly runs rings around the whole process and goes, like this, the guys that you are working with don't need that kind of traditional management structure. It's not about beating conformity into the team. It's about unleashing individuality and unleashing genius because that's where you get the good ideas. And you can see that she's very clearly like talking about what she prefers for herself. Like she wants that
Yeah,
autonomy for herself.
we go back and forth on that, don't we? Where she's kind
Yeah.
of that visionary, because Joe is a really interesting visionary from a point of view of he understands what needs to be done to fill the gap again, to fill that third shelf. Yet he knows that he needs to do something more revolutionary. And again, that balance point, that triangle between Gordon and Cameron, and Cameron still is pushing for the innovation. And it's really funny that this guy has her on printer drivers or something like that, and she's just like, wait, oh, like that, is this like another Joe challenge lesson of the week type thing? And yes, but she learns very quickly, and I think she dominates in the end, and she really grows out of her skin. And I think that's where I started really respecting Cameron as a character.
I think she's also it almost feel like she's also learning how to make friends, like what to value in people and what to respect in people. She's finally in a room of people that she can actually have some like equal respect for. We've got the first couple of actors who are coming in who like it feels like two of these coders are going to be regulars, right? Like we've
Yeah,
gone to the trouble of finding out their names. There's Yo-Yo and Lev, who you feel like we're going to see them more often. Interestingly, also the first, I don't think there's been another regular non-white character. So Yo-Yo is played by a guy called Cooper Andrews, whose father's heritage is Samoan. And
he's on The
actually,
Walking Dead at the moment.
yeah, I was going to say he's probably best known for The Walking Dead. He's actually, I was doing a little bit of wiki stalking. He's actually Jewish.
Oh wow.
And interestingly, I thought that Lev was very clearly coded as obviously Jewish.
Yeah.
So it's a guy called August Emerson. But I kind of loved that these two characters for the first time bring us a little bit of actual diversity, a little bit of emotional diversity as well, because they're just
They're outsiders.
they're outsiders.
Yeah, not in the same way that Cameron is an outsider.
No, not in the same way that Joe is.
Or Cameron, from the point of view that she's always been a lone wolf. Like she's like, I do my piece of music here, my coding, but it's not really doesn't really convert to some of the others.
They're kind of bringing her into that she's creating an orchestra at last for her bit of music.
Yes.
Like she's creating a sense of community, and these guys feel instantly community-ish. Like they understand each other. They have the slight nerd standoff where it's just like you kind of have to test what people know and what they don't know. And where she kind of almost tests their personality types in order to decide who should stay and who should go.
That was awesome. And
I loved that.
And I loved the boss scene at night where he's like, in my office now. How the hell do I get out of this cave? I love that. Because it was It was a moment where everyone could just like it just took him by storm. And one of the IMDb facts that I had to read out for you is actually that Adventure, the title of the episode, does obviously refer to the game that everyone is playing on their computer. But the original game is called Colossal Cave Adventure. And it was written originally on Fortran by Will Crowther in 1976 and expanded on by Don Woods in 1977. One of the first computer games and the origin of conversational games. And the best part about this, which I am so annoyed that I missed out on, is that AMC launched a web version of the game soon after the episode was aired so people can play with it. Yeah, and stupid GDPR, aside from the requirements of privacy, we can't play this game.
Oh, that's so sad.
I know,
I really wanted to try that.
But how cool is this reference to both the name and what's going on without actually saying, like, did you know that I'm playing the first ever very popular computer game? Like, it doesn't matter. Everyone's on it, and that's how it would be. It's like Pokemon Go.
Absolutely. And you get the guys who ultimately always look for the workaround. It's like, obviously I'm playing like 400 or 500 hours of Animal Crossing with my daughter at the moment. And it's like, she's watching all the YouTube videos about how do you breed this hybrid and how do you get around this and blah, blah, blah. And, before YouTube ever existed, there was still a community of nerds communicating with each other about like how you get through a back door and how you skip this and do that, or how you extend that. And if there's an Easter egg here.
And impressing each other as well on those things, right? Like you get around it.
And the people who are the rule breakers and the people who are like, look, I respect the rules of the game, but I also want to break it and take it apart and see what happens and get around it. And the people who see that as a challenge are the people that Cameron wants to have around her. They have the same mindset as her, which is like, yes, I see the beauty of what has been created here, but also I want to see the back of the stitching, right? I want to see how it all lines up at the back and take things apart and rearrange things to my own liking. And I really hope that we do see more of Yo-Yo and Lev, because it feels like they bring out of Cameron a side that is more joyful, more creative, more free.
More supportive, I think. If you remember some of the first episodes where she's like stuck in the dungeon downstairs behind this cage, like freaking out and shit, you don't really see that side anymore. And she's kind of getting lucky in a way with the corporate structure, because one of the things that I liked about the episode portraying this sort of, a manager's going to come in and you're going to do what they tell you, even though you know it's not the right thing to do, or that you feel like you should have a conversation about it being done otherwise. And she kind of gets around that in a very smart way. And following senior, Joe MacMillan Sr. saying that Joe actually tricked someone into quitting so he could take their job. I mean, the anecdotes, though, in this episode are actually quite interesting, because that scene that you were talking about when they wake up and she's like, come on, how did you get this car? Oh, well, back in the... No, come on, how did you get it? Well, actually, no, how did you get it? What do you mean? Like, it's fascinating how they can both keep doing that to each other. And Cameron really shines in this episode, I think, for all the things that we mentioned. Now, one of the other things, and this is what I meant earlier when talking about some of the things that we find out from the episode, is we actually find out that her dad was also in the Vietnam War and didn't make it back. Now, she's also wearing military cameo, which is kind of all tied in.
Yeah, I did notice that she always has like a military backpack. Do you know what I mean? She always has that kind of army surplus
And the
look
patch,
going
yeah.
on. And I did wonder in the first few episodes, I thought maybe it's just because you find a lot of that stuff in thrift stores and she's not got very much money up until now. But it seems like it's also like if the baseball bat is Joe's connection to a dad that he cannot speak the same language as, but has the same name and the same instincts as, and that, you know, if he's fighting that through the baseball bat, then this army camo and military kind of tat that
Yeah.
Cameron is carrying around with her is her connection to her dad. And it's interesting that up until now she hasn't really talked about her dad to anyone, but the first person that gets that nugget of information out of her is another dad.
And he kind of, I do feel like he was genuine, where he felt like he overstepped and started saying that you must have only been 4. He served in the war, and he was very genuine in that they had a proper connection there for a second, and a very different connection than what she has with Joe. Because it could have gone anywhere, right? She could have easily slept with Joe's dad to be like, well, I'm really screwing you, I'm sticking it to you, but obviously they didn't really go there. But it did feel like they had a different level of connection, and similar to what she has with Boss in that fatherly way. But again, with an outsider, right? And someone that's actually seen something else. Because what you have here between Boss and Senior are two figures that have been in their places for like 20 years and in those bubbles. And she's kind of absorbing the best. I don't know if the best of both, but she's kind of getting the privilege to get a little bit of both. Now, I was kind of annoyed with the whole like, oh, you could be Lovelace, and I worked with her, and you don't really know if that's true. It's like, oh, Grace Hopper, sorry, Grace Hopper.
The Grace Hopper thing. Yeah, I liked it, but I also know what you mean.
It's like telling every single person, like, you're a great artist, like you're gonna be Van Gogh, and you're like, well, or not, you can be your own person.
But it is intriguing that he knows, he intuits very quickly that the right lever
Those
to
pressure
pull
points,
with Cameron is to talk about a woman who is particularly successful in her field. And a woman is successful in the military, and in technology, which is an extraordinary like double whammy. And to take a slight tangent for a second, I don't know if you know this, but allegedly, and I think this has been an unconfirmed story, but allegedly the reason that we call problems with computer programs bugs originates from a story about Grace Hopper, where there was I believe a moth or another bug that literally flew into some machinery. But that it's an apocryphal story. No one knows if it's just been attributed to her.
I'll take it
after the fact. But it's a nice little story. And actually, so a little bit of human interest background. Alex and I used to work together in an agency that had rooms named after various people, including Grace Hopper. And the decor in that room had little moths all over the wall, and that was why.
There you go. What I did.
A little bit of personal insight.
I did think back about those days when mentioning this, and again, amazing reference points. Amazing reference points that the show knows where to acknowledge these icons by both embodying them, but also saying things like, "I want to get on a flight with Bill Gates," right?
Yeah, and I got to say that scene is very good writing. And John Getz, who guest stars as Joe's dad, I think does a lot with a little, because you could come into that role and just be a sort of, I am overbearing dad. I come in, I sound overbearing, I leave again. But he gets, like, that conversation with Cameron teases out lots of little warm subtleties. And like Joe, like the big thing that he has in common with Joe Jr. is that you never know exactly when each one of them is being sincere. You know they're both capable of it, but you also know they're capable of performing it. And in that scene with Cameron, you get to have that whole range
Yes.
in little shortcuts. You get to see him looking quite sincerely upset that he has trampled on this kind of memory of her dad, but also then trying to manipulate her and her appearing to fall for it and then shutting it down. And I love that, it's a very short scene, but you get a lot out of it. And I thought John Getz did that really beautifully.
He did, and it's not easy to put to put a new character into a room with someone else and just have a scene that's like a conversation with this kind of exposure. Now, you touch on something related to parents. We also meet Donna's father. We had already met Donna's mother, so I'm glad that she's back in a sort of like we just continue on type scenario,
Mm.
and kind of the opposite. But I do think that Donna's parents are more stereotypical because of the class that they sit in. It's like they gotta shout about the magazine and this and
Oh my
the
God.
Japanese love me and we just closed this deal and blah 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 blah. Like they need to boast about it.
The class markers that sit around Donna are incredible. So the fact that her dad, who as an aside is played by Chris Mulkey, who is an absolute hey, it's that guy of like TV character actors. You see him everywhere and he's
Yeah.
always great. He immediately wants to play golf, right? It's the ultimate instant. Oh, Donna comes from people who have made money.
Yeah.
And then the
Access.
fact that she then sits in the garage playing the
Yes.
piano, like that she's playing classical music on the piano, is just, and then you get Gordon kind of looking at it from afar, and it's just like not intruding on it, because there is a world that Donna belongs to that every time Gordon tries to enter it, he has to grovel or he screws up. Like he tries to get into the, like he asks for the introduction to the Japanese, screws it up, and then has to go and apologize and fix it afterwards. And he's so inept with the whole thing, and he's so awkward. But Donna's, like, we've suspected from the start, we've covered this in a few episodes where we suspected from the start that she might come from a different class than Gordon. And I think that often when we talk about when we talk about the UK, people are clear that we have like a really obvious class system in this country. And I think people like to think that's not the case in other countries. There is absolutely a class
I
system in the
mean,
US, and this episode, like, absolutely skewers
a
it.
hundred percent.
So
And touching on Donna
yeah,
actually, and I'm so glad you made that observation about her playing the piano because to be honest with you, I was like, what's this about? And obviously, now that you're saying it, it makes a lot of sense. And Gordon coming in and sort of peeking through and seeing her, not only because for me it was more a case of he's seeing her in her element, and she's not really able to be that all the time, maybe because of other compromises as we've seen. But let's talk about Donna for a little bit. That scene with Hunt calling her
hmm.
right after Gordon calls her. Are we having another? We're sliding into a potential affair situation, and
There's something there, isn't there? Because he can very quickly influence her. Like he just mentions the vodka and the pie crust, and she's like, "Huh, gonna try it out." And actually, that was the scene where I noticed the over the camera shot, because it happens a lot in that call with her, where it's like the camera just sits over Scott Michael Foster's shoulder, and like it's like a little, it's almost like trying to see Donna from his point of view, but down the phone. Like I don't know what was going on there with the sightlines, but it was so elegant, and I really enjoyed it. And I loved like the difference in her tone. Obviously, she's talking to him differently. He's her boss, and she can't like snap at him the way she snaps at Gordon or whatever. But she's got all this tension because of her parents and because of everything that's going on. And she just softens so much in that conversation. And she just like, I mean, it felt like flirting to me. I like, maybe I'm not very good at spotting it because I've been married for 100 years, but it felt like flirting to
I
me.
don't know if I can spot it because I've been single for like 100 years. So, but I think it was flirty. Donna, I'm conflicted about this because she's very well rounded as a character. Okay, in my eyes, she only grows to be even better. But she seems to me like she's a confident person, yet she's kind of also just dying for attention. So when Hunt gives her that attention by calling her to her house, we don't know what time it is, but and apologizing for being so rough on her. or for snapping at her instead of recognizing her value in not only the food chain but also the relationship and where he's at. That to me plays quite interestingly around, does she soften to the point where this is going to cost a lot more than it seems originally? Because you'd almost expect Gordon to make these mistakes. You almost expect him to get completely wasted and then do something that he'll regret and then crawl back and just sneak into
Absolutely.
bed, right?
I'm almost waiting for the revelation that Gordon's already had an affair because he's
Yes.
just so that guy. He's so the guy to screw up. Like he just blunders forward. But Donna seems much more restrained and maybe like in a good way, a bit more
She is
calculated than that.
calculated, yeah.
And yet she, like, this is the most girlish I think we've really seen her.
The relationship between Hunt and Donna, I think it's going to be an interesting one from a point of view of what is it going to get in the way of? Is it the marriage? We talked about this in the last episode. I want to rehash that. But is it going to be the marriage? Is it going to be the work? What's next for Donna, right? So she saw this major problem that they had in the last episode, and she's kind of actually looking back at this. Her reaction, we covered this, but her reaction to Gordon being kind of okay with what Joe did
Did it
to
work?
Cameron to teach her a lesson, that it worked. Is this going to drift them apart a little bit in terms of Donna realizing that maybe she doesn't know as well, or that she can't really control the situation as much as she thought she could?
And I mean, she's quoted in the article, but she's quoted under this made up name that Gordon gave her. And she's just like, Gordon's like, oh, you've been quoted. He's kind of excited about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And she's like, Susan was quoted. And, that little drop of, she's had a tiny little opening to see another world. And then when she has this moment with Hunt and he's quite hard on her, it's like, oh, I had this little moment of freedom where people actually respected what I could do. And now I'm back to being berated like I'm supposed to bring the coffee in meetings. And I'm curious if we're going to get another very Donna episode soon.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
I mean, there's no amount of time that I couldn't spend watching her. Donna is in many ways, like I know Joe is the mysterious character, right? Like we know that he makes up a lot of his own story, but in many ways, Donna is the one who feels, to me, the most unpredictable at this point. So Gordon is predictably going to F things up, right? He is predictably going to lurch from one crisis to another because that is Gordon. Like you can see it coming in the lunch. Well, we can talk about him in more detail in a second, but you can see it coming in the dinner with a Japanese businessman. You can absolutely see that he's going to make a mess of things.
Oh, God.
Joe is like marching to his own drum, but you can see a sort of through line of like, I am the visionary, I am the leader. Cameron she can be toddlery and unpredictable in that sense of like, oh, I'm going to throw my toys out the pram or whatever. But again, what she cares about and what's driving her. I still don't know if we know what drives Donna. Like, we've seen inklings, we've seen little tiny bits of it. Like we've seen her get excited about doing her more technical job. We've seen her be pleased that something was well received at work. We've seen her be, a loving and supportive and engaged mother. We've seen her be a dutiful and charming daughter, but I still don't know if we know what drives her.
No, we don't. We don't know what, and we also don't know. Yeah, we don't know what drives her. We don't know if these sort of shimmers of Hunt's giving her either a hard time and then apologizing, or the little 15 minutes of fame through her fake name is something that she wants, or does she want to be in the picture? Does she not want to be in the picture? Like, is it the family thing or is it something else? And I think having her parents there is also, and it's quite interesting actually seeing their house and they're having their own like separate party. Again, to your point about, we get it, they're very well off and clearly connected, but also hardworking from the point of view of sort of, you can tell that he built that magazine or that publication or whatever it is. And I think I'm really looking forward to just seeing what does drive her or what just pushes her over the edge, right? It's going to be one or the other. It's going to be, and how much Gordon is tied into that.
Absolutely. I mean, her dad is the definition of like a self-made man, right? He's got his catalog, he got built up from nothing, he's made all this money, he's enjoying his money. He has understood to an extent what Joe manipulates extremely well, which is reputation and appearance and like
The
the
American dream,
reputation.
also in a way.
Yeah, the reputation thing is hammered really hard. And like obviously one of the reasons why the businessmen are Japanese is because and I remember this because I grew up through it. There was a time when electronics were absolutely synonymous with Japan, and that was just that was what was out in front, and that was the future. And so it makes total sense. But also Japan is a culture that is so closely tied in our Western understanding of it with reputation and politeness and cultural and values and a cultural structure where there is very clear right and wrong. There is the right way to do things, and everything else is the wrong way to do things. And it feels like Joe lives that to the nth degree, because even though he's kind of positioned as a bit of a maverick, he uses every single bit of like convention to manipulate other people. Like he uses convention and he uses appearance to do that. And in his own way, Donna's dad is very similar. Like he uses the conventions and he's fully understood the language of the world in which he does business. He has learned to, he's forged these close relationships with Japanese businessmen and investors because he has learned to sing to the hymn sheet correctly. Gordon is incapable of doing that because Gordon is, bless him, a beautiful loser. But he just can't do it. He just doesn't. He lives in his own little world
he's so misguided.
He's so misguided, and I sort of feel a bit sorry for him because I think I have definitely been the awkward person in the room who didn't speak the same language as other people. Like I'm definitely a little bit weird, and in some situations. And I really felt for him in some ways, because I was like, I could totally see myself accidentally like just messing things up. But then when he starts drinking heavily, you're like, oh, come on. Like
you're doing it to yourself.
You're doing it to yourself,
absolutely.
Man. Have the self-awareness.
I was a bit annoyed when Joe at first wasn't sort of giving him credit for his, brilliant idea of how to maximize something that is revolutionary for that kind of technology, which is a screen and a watch, which actually surprised me as well. And then he sort of was like, actually, great idea. How did you pull this off? And Gordon, of course, lied, because that's the other thing. Like Gordon, all he wants to do is be cool, so he has to lie about how he gets into these things, and I get it. But one of the interesting things with the father-in-law, was how they knew about their failed project, and he didn't want to repeat that again. So that, to me, is getting really interesting, because all we're told is, not this again. No, like what happened, right? Yeah. Just like we're getting told that Joe trashed IBM and all the stories. What actually happened, and was it Gordon that? What was it? Was it the context? Was it just?
I'm dying to know.
Was it far ahead of its time? I'm dying to know, because clearly there's no more trusting Gordon. I think even from Donna, from that point of view, around what he's done or what went wrong there. But the attitude that Gordon has when he wakes up or when he comes back from the office and, oh, hey, Gary, happy birthday. And then the golf course sort of begging for this to be the thing that finally makes him cool. And he is so out of line. He is so out of line with his Japanese man. And my favorite line, sorry to cut you off, my favorite line when he's telling Joe about Japanese culture is Joe saying, I've been to Tokyo 9 times. Like, Gordon, like, sit your ass back down.
And I mean, I'd really like to know what happened with the symphonic, not just because it's clear, like you say, it's clearly completely drained the trust out of everyone. And even Joe seems to know something about it, because reading about it is how he pulled on Gordon's strings in the first place to get him involved. But also the nature of why it failed, I think, will tell us a lot about Gordon, right? Did it fail because it didn't work? Was it that kind of failure? Did it fail, like you say, because it was just too far ahead, which would position him as something closer to a Cameron than to like a Donna, like Donna feels like she set herself up at the beginning to go, like Cameron's code is like music and she likes to do the more technical parts of things. Like, is he more of a kind of builder and constructor of things, or is he a more of a visionary? um like, knowing why it failed ought to tell us something about, like, did Gordon rush it? Did he try to put something out before it was ready? Like, did he get impatient?
Yeah, or did he not have the oversight that Joe brings to the table, or the corporate backing? Like, because we also don't know. 'Cause Gordon, this just jumped into my head that we know that Gordon's been in at Cardiff Electric for a while, but actually, did he try this project while working there and sort of on the side and not be able to get this backing originally from people like Boss? Like, is there a history already with this? I do kind of wonder, sort of about those things. Gordon, he just to me keeps just saying all the wrong things. Like, even when he like the I thought the Japanese sort of stereotype was a bit much, to be honest with you.
I wondered if we were being set up for something with the Japanese stuff. Like, it was almost, look, there are quite a few stereotypes running through this show.
Sure.
Like here we've got, the father-in-law that plays golf. You've got the coders who like spray cheese into their mouths. Oh, look, they're coders. That must mean they're a bit unwashed and slobby. And so I just thought, oh God, are we playing with another stereotype here? But the Japanese guys were largely there to represent a thing rather than themselves. Like, we don't know anything about them. One of them, I think, never actually speaks. So it felt a little bit like, oh, really? For some of it.
Yeah. And I thought, to your point, that it was going to be a case of they're going to surprise us. They're so quiet that they're going to turn and be like, stop messing with me. Like, stop fucking around. I know exactly what you want. Type of, like, we've been here before. But no, they're just mute and sort of sat there and feeling really uncomfortable. And I thought actually Gordon was, when he was touching him and the whole scene in the bathroom, which was so cringe, like in a good way, right? It was so well done, but I was like, oh my
I know.
God, Gordon,
I was
please.
just like squeezing everything together. Like, Gordon, shut up. Gordon, shut up. Shut up. Just pee and shut up.
I thought, like, is he gonna cross a line there with something else? But when he's explaining what a schmuck is,
Oh yeah.
it was like Gordon, like, you can tell that you have never left the town that you're in. This is why Joe has been to Tokyo 9 times.
Yes.
And funnily enough, we are on equal footing with these two, because if you remember back on the pilot episode where they're in this business dinner or lunch, and Gordon puts his foot in it, and then
Yep. It's a painful retread. Like, Gordon's learnt nothing. He has learnt nothing. The last one, they went in, Joe did his thing, Gordon undermined it, Joe yelled at Gordon. The last one, this time round, they go in, Joe does his thing, Gordon undermines it, Joe yells at Gordon. But the big difference then is Gordon taking it into his own hands to go and fix it. And he does that probably less for his own reputation and more for the project, because he really believes in the project now. Like, he really just wants it to work.
and also Donna, I think. And it was really interesting that Donna was just like, it'll be fine, go back to sleep. Like, I don't know. It was really weird. You don't know who he's doing it for, but you're right. It was more for the practice. But also, don't forget that we start with these guys who start to idolize him, right? Like, they passes this test, Gordon, and then you get the speech of, like, Gordon, like, oh my God, I never thought I would be here, um, working on this project with you, but I've learned so much. So he doesn't want to let these guys down. Like, he's suddenly a Joe from a respected point of view, and he remember episode 3 where the neighbor Brian was telling him how to be and what to do and what not to say, and we finally get a Gordon that's actually accomplishing stuff by leading a team and growing comfortable with his peers and his subordinates, to then crash down. And that the crushing thing was that Joe and Gordon scene, more so than Gordon having to apologize or Gordon messing up the deal or Joe having to rescue. That scene between them two and how far I thought Gordon was very kind of like also childish.
Yeah, I don't know. I felt like Gordon was more childlike than childish. Like it was almost like
Yeah,
he
that's
was
what I mean.
regressing
Yeah.
more than acting out. But I like your observation is spot on that actually we never see Gordon apologize to his father-in-law. We don't see that scene. We just see him knock at the door and he's standing there and he's looking a little bit beaten down. Um,
And drunk.
and drunk. But you don't see that because it's not important to see Gordon. Like, we've already seen him debase himself slightly to his father in law when he was begging for the meeting to be set up in the first place. We don't need to see him do that again. We've got their dynamic, we understand it. What we do need to see is that recalibration of the dynamic between him and Joe, where he's not going to let it happen the same way it did last time. He's not going to let it end with Joe berating him and mocking him. And Joe really, like, we see Joe yelling a lot, we see him directing a lot, we rarely see him being cruel and mocking, and he really tries to humiliate Gordon here in a way that he
Yes.
hasn't really done to anyone else. Like, not so directly. Like, he said humiliating things to people one to one, but you've never seen him do a big group shaming before.
No.
Gordon's kind of crawled up to this ledge and Joe's trying to knock him off, and for once this is why I was saying at the beginning of the episode, like, I don't feel like we got very far in understanding. Like, we see little bits of Cameron unlocking. We don't really see that much more of Donna apart from that little flirty moment. We, right at the end, maybe see a little push for Joe. But if anyone gets anything out of this episode, it's Gordon, who, like, is really from the the accident and the firing in the past episodes, and from not being able to kill the bird, going through to, I'm going to fire people, I'm going to hold my own, even if it means embarrassing myself a little bit to do it. Like, the one whose growth has actually been slow and steady through this is weirdly the guy who keeps screwing things up.
It felt more earned because when he got the big office, it was kind of like, here you go. And now it kind of feels like he's got something that he needs to uphold. And it's actually, yes, Donna is involved in this, but again, it wasn't the you brought the girls to bail me out situation again. It was completely transcending that. Now, uh, Joe didn't interact with his dad. I like the twist where so not really a twist, but actually the Japanese were staying in the same hotel, and that
Yeah.
kind of like circularity of it all, and we've seen this in previous episodes that it kind of all goes around. The bird is at the beginning and the end, etc.
Yeah, they like their bookends. Like you said earlier, you can't do a neat episode in one because it's not that kind of show. It's not a procedural. So in place of that, they do seem to put bookends in the episode so that you at least have a structural sense of completeness, even if you can't complete a thought or complete a
Yeah,
narrative.
in a regular TV universe, you would have Joe and Gordon coming to the office and saying, the guys left finally, but we're doing this. No, here you see them leaving. You give them that space. They get in the car, and Joe's dad is also there, getting in the car and leaving the article and saying, I'm done with this. Now, I presume he will be back because otherwise, what's the point of this entire setup for him to not even try? But I do wonder because we see it from Joe's point of view. Like, I don't want to be like my father, or he never looked after me if my mother ended up being whatever. But what is the beef specifically here between these two, and why is the anti IBM such a strong purpose for Joe, right?
And why did he blow something up when he left? Because, like, we know that there was an incident when he left. Like, what
He
did he
blows
do?
everything up. He is literally the gif of a flaming trash can in the flood. Like, is there any episode where he's not gonna bang something up?
Like, it's really fascinating because I guess the key to Gordon is knowing what happened with his past project that failed. The key to Joe is knowing what the hell happened in this relationship that went so sour so quickly. Like, why is he incapable of seeing anything through without, like, having a toddler tantrum and leaving it all behind?
But also, is this relationship the key to understanding some of the other elements, right?
Yeah.
I think that's for me the bigger piece. I thought this episode versus maybe episode 3 or even 4 really brought in an outside that felt like it tied into the story a lot better, right? It wasn't like a Lulu and the mom. No, everything, like, Donna's parents had something to do to influence what was going on in the negotiations,
Yeah.
which in turn had something to do with the progression of the project, which also had to do with, you know, the father interacting with Cameron. So there were all those little connections done, and
Yeah.
I feel like, again, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but I feel like this is what the show ends up excelling at. It's these connections and how a phone call can sort of tint the entire thing one way or another.
Yeah, and it felt like the payoff for having had that messy third episode where everyone in the kitchen sink was thrown in was that now in this episode we don't have to reintroduce them. They are a natural part of what's going on. Maybe it wasn't done as elegantly as it could have been 2 episodes ago, but now we can use them. We can make them plot. We can now extend to Donna's father. Like I said, the coders feel like they're going to be around. Like I feel like you don't go to the trouble of finding out what people's names are or having that much of a conversation with the lead character unless you're going to show up in several episodes. You know, so there's something going on there.
I'm happy for them to show up as and when they want to throughout the season.
Yeah, we're not going to have a big emotional
again,
arc around Cameron and Yo-Yo becoming best friends. Like I will predict that much. Even though I can't really remember what happens for the rest of this season because apparently I just forget things as soon as I've seen them. I just remember that I love them. Like we're clearly not going to have that kind of thing, but he brings out something in Cameron that I think we'll see again. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I question in the grand scheme of things whether this episode got us very far down the road, but I also don't remember sticking on that the first time I watched it. So I think a lot of my kind of like, I'm not sure whether I love it 100% feelings are more about stopping to think of this one in isolation than looking at the like and I'm sure at some point, like at the end of the season, we'll do a kind of roundup. Let's look at season 1 episode and we can then talk about the kind of peaks and troughs. And I don't think this is a trough. I just think it's almost like it really feels like a reset. It feels like we tried a load of experimental stuff in episodes 1 to 4, and now we're like bringing it back home. We've got the script back in the hands of the guys who created it. They're like recalibrating around that North Star a bit, which is all about failure, right? Like they've said all along, the show is about failure and about perceptions of success. And we have come back into that area really, really firmly. So now I'm genuinely excited to see how the next, because they've got to cover a lot of ground in the next 4 episodes. They've got to get that product out the door, presumably, because otherwise, what's the whole point of the season, right? So there's a lot now to cover.
Going back to your thoughts around whether it got us anywhere, them having that big meeting in the boardroom at the beginning around the third shelf as the first thing that happens in the episode, you know, in terms of arc, kind of gets that out of the way from a point of view of like, right, here's where we are with the project, right? That's that timeline. Here's where we are with the relationships. Now, me and you are sort of microscopically looking at the relationships because those are the things that we know really make the show and the interaction between these characters. But to your point, the end of the season has to be driving to the creation of this product. Now, I also wonder, is the creation of the product going to set the world on fire? Is that the point? Or is it, let's make sure these people don't kill each other before that happens? And I think what they're trying to do on the character point of view is just making us care about why they are going to fault each other more than why we should care that they stick together as a band, if that makes any sense. And so that this is where the parents and the sort of weird seeds that are being planted on Joe specifically are really coming to life. So, and I do really like that, playing with that negative space, if you will, from a writing point of view, because it really helps color in what you might already infer, even if sometimes it's been over the head.
And on the writing, just before, because I feel like we're coming to a natural close now, before we wrap, on the writing, so Christopher Cantwell these days is a comic book writer. He writes Iron Man for Marvel.
Is he?
He is indeed. He actually has a really interesting Twitter feed and writes a lot about his comic book writing and that kind of thing. And I find it really fascinating that the character that he has ended up writing is this messed up visionary who doesn't really know how to hold a team together. And I like, it almost feels like I can see the parallels with Joe MacMillan stretching out into the past. So I
Are you
now
saying this is like a spiritual successor? Should I be reading this?
I just feel like I haven't read any of Christopher Cantwell's Iron Man comics, but there definitely feels like there's like a drop of Tony Stark in Joe MacMillan, and except that Tony can actually create stuff. Whereas what was that quote from the episode? I wrote it down because I loved it so much. Must be nice to have a job where you can say words without actually having to do anything. I
Yes.
loved that. Loved that
Gordon
line.
Gordon calling him out on this was
But,
also amazing because
yeah.
no one else had.
No,
Cameron
it's just
always
beautiful.
has like a little talk about it, but yeah, it's so on point.
It was a
isn't
beautiful
It's so on
encapsulation. So
point.
yeah, to that extent, I guess he's no Tony Stark, but now I feel like almost conditioned to look for comic book hints in the past in any
Nice.
episode where Christopher Cantwell was involved directly in the writing, or and I think later on he directs an episode as well. So now I'm like preconditioned to try and spot that, because I feel like you don't wander into comic book writing by accident. It's something that you do because you're already passionate about the genre. So even if he didn't do it before Holt, he definitely did it afterwards. So yeah.
Here's a free idea: bring back Agent Carter TV
Oh,
with
yes.
Chris as the writer, and let it be. How's that?
Yeah, with the splendiferous, beauteous, like, my God, I love Haley Atwell so much. I really
And without
adore
Chad
her.
Michael Murray, I mean, he's a handsome
I
piece
know,
of human
I
being.
warmed to his character, but you know what? That's a that's a show for another podcast. I think I could talk about that first season forever, because I think it is the only truly perfect season of Marvel TV. Is just that season 1 of Agent Carter. But anyway, on that marvelous note, sorry, that is, I think, it for this episode. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for listening and not making us feel like we are, and use this in a sentence this week, all hat and no cattle. We will be back next week. I know we had a brief unscripted interlude while we struggled, ironically enough, with some tech issues, which probably should have told us something, but we're going to just keep cracking on. We will be back next week with episode 6 called Landfall. In the meantime, come and join us on Twitter. Our handle is TTTGYTTT. Think about it. Share your thoughts, questions, and comments. On that note, thank you very much to Will, who tweeted us in the last week about Close to the Metal, and recommended that we do actually read a book which is kind of referenced in the show, called The Soul of a New Machine. We love additions to our reading list. We love comments and questions. So please keep them coming. And thank you so much for listening.
Even better, subscribe to this podcast on your podcast app of choice, and you'll never miss an episode. We are now on all the apps. And thank you so much for continuing to listen with us. I'm hearing some great feedback in terms of people falling back in love with the show, or just getting into it. So please let us know what you think also we should be covering going forward. We are very passionate about obviously these characters and the way they're portrayed, and the way everything is shot. And we're so looking forward to continuing to cover the rest of the season and beyond. So see you in the next one.
Oh my God, halfway point.